Hello everyone, Mason here. How you doing? Today it's time for a book review. Suzy Arlington knows her neighbour before she meets her, because she can hear the sound of Emily's life unfolding above her head. The sound of Emily's heels against the cheap wooden floorboards tells Suzy what room she's in, and whether Emily is talking on the phone, making a meal, listening to music, or even having sex, Suzy can hear it all. One day the incessant noise just stops. Emily has gone missing, and nobody, whether it's her family, her co-workers, or the police, seem to care. Suzy realises that she may be Emily's only chance, the only one that cares enough to look for her, the only one who can save her, because she knows Emily best. After all, she heard everything. The Girl Upstairs is the debut novel by Georgina Lees, published on the 9th of December 2021. I was excited about this book. As somebody who's lived in a block of flats for 8 years now, it held an irresistible premise for me. Poor Suzy really can hear everything. The paper-thin walls make sure of that, and I know that feeling all too well. The first third of this book was almost too relatable. I've lived underneath people like Emily. I am familiar with the sound of a knife against the kitchen side as they prepare a meal, the feet thudding on your ceiling as they dance to their favourite song, which they're listening to as loud as possible. The obnoxious partying that goes on through the night and into the early hours of the morning. The cackling laughter. The sex that's so uncomfortably loud that they must be trying to advertise how unbelievably good it is. And the drama. The arguments. Well, they're the best bit. You gotta find a silver lining somewhere. Hilariously, Suzy even says she knows when Emily is going to the bathroom, which again is something that I am, unfortunately, all too familiar with. At one point, early on, Suzy bangs on the ceiling with a broom to just get Emily to be a little bit quieter, and that leads to a confrontation, which is something that's happened to me before. This particular incident happened a few years after I moved into the bottom floor flat I live in now. My upstairs neighbour at the time purchased a treadmill. Yeah, a treadmill. I can't express to you how unbelievably loud that was. I'm not kidding or exaggerating when I say that you could hear it in every room of the flat. It literally shook the walls. Feeling frustrated, I hit the ceiling with a broom and felt relieved when she stopped using the treadmill. To my horror though, I then heard the sound of her footsteps leaving the flat, going down the communal hallway stairs, and before I knew it, she was knocking on my door. I didn't know what to do. I don't like confrontation, but I couldn't pretend not to be in. I'd just whacked the ceiling, so I had to answer. In the resulting back and forth that we had, she told me that if I didn't like noise, then I shouldn't be living in a block of flats. I can't lie, when Emily says that exact line to Suzy, I had a little bit of a flashback to that moment, and my hackles were up big time. In hindsight, I do realise that hitting the ceiling was probably a little bit over the top. I could have just gone up there, knocked on a door and talked to her about it, which would have probably been more productive and would have meant that my neighbour didn't hate me. However, I do still stand by the fact that if you live in a block of flats and you don't live on the bottom floor, using a treadmill is inconsiderate and probably not a good idea. You're literally running on somebody's ceiling. If it had happened during lockdown, it might have been a bit of a different story. Still annoying, but more understandable. Anyway, I'm getting totally sidetracked. The point is, the first third is just way too relatable. Unfortunately though, I do feel that that's the strongest part, and after that, things start to slow down and fall apart. I do feel that Georgina Lees genuinely has the bones of a great story with The Girl Upstairs. I just don't feel that she put the meat on them effectively. As much as I hate to say it, one of my main problems is with the writing and how confusing it can get. Around halfway through, we start getting chapters from Emily's point of view, but her narration doesn't feel any different to Susie's, and if your attention wanders for 30 seconds or so, it's much too easy to miss the point at which it switches over. The only way to distinguish between the two characters is that Susie's chapters are in present tense and Emily's are in past tense. I would have much preferred it if Emily's chapters had been in third person, because that would have made things much clearer. There's also the fact that whilst Emily's name is at the beginning of her chapters, Susie's isn't at the beginning of hers, which meant that I didn't register when we'd switch back to Susie straight away. The most confusing thing I encountered was a chapter in which there was a flashback to Susie's past, but it was still narrated in the first person present tense. There was only one way that I could tell it wasn't actually happening in the present timeline of the story, but I can't get into that because of spoilers. Another problem that I had is something that seems to be a common problem in these sorts of stories where a character is investigating a mystery, and that's that the police end up being presented as absolutely useless, which needs to happen, otherwise they would uncover the truth before the main character does. But as a fan of detective fiction, I just don't like it. There's also a few questionable decisions which the police make that I don't believe they would in real life, like cutting Susie way too much slack, and one particular police officer acted in a way that I found unbelievable and seemed a little bit unprofessional. I wasn't much for Emily's chapters. To be honest, they had rich people problems written all over them, and I just struggled to relate. They also didn't contain any characters with any depth that I cared about, including Emily, because they made up less than a third of the actual story, and I just didn't feel like we had enough time to get to know Emily and emotionally invest in what happened to her. If we had been given more chance, I do feel that there was a few moments that could have had a lot more impact, but sadly they just fell flat. I wish the pacing had been better. If Georgina Lees had managed to keep it consistent throughout, it would have been a much more engaging read, but it drags in the middle. I found myself getting bored and my attention started to wander. Whilst the pace does pick up in the last third, the conclusion comes too fast, and it's explored much less than I would have liked. Something happens that is only really implied, and I just found it a little bit unsatisfactory. It's actually a massive shame because there's some pretty interesting concepts at play. The way that depression and grief can lead to somebody feeling lonely and isolated, even when they live in one of the most populated cities in the world. And actually the fact that there's so many people around and yet they feel so little connection can make them feel much worse. The difficulty and importance of allowing yourself to move forward and find happiness after a tragic life event. The way that we blame ourselves for things that we had no control over, and how our guilt and desire not to allow the past to repeat itself can lead to obsessive and self-destructive behaviour. How we can live so close to one another and not know each other at all. The way that our lives unfold in parallel and can subtly affect each other. The way that some people assume so often that other people's lives are better than theirs, and yet appearances can be deceptive. Someone who seems happy can be hiding a much deeper sadness. We never really know what's going on behind closed doors, even if we think we can hear what's happening. The list doesn't end there, and that might be one of the problems. Maybe Georgina Lees just bit off a bit more than she could chew. Tried to juggle too many chainsaws and ended up beheading herself in the process. The thing is, as much as the themes she's playing with present so much potential, I don't feel like the exploration of them is executed all that well and never really feels like it goes any deeper than surface level. With a story like this, you need a strong main character, somebody that we can emotionally invest in so that what happens matters. And unfortunately, Susie isn't that. I'm not sure whether the blame falls at the feet of Georgina Lees for the writing or Meg Travers for the somewhat monotone, emotionless way in which she narrates the audiobook though. That delivery would have worked if Susie had been a dispassionate, emotionless character. She's not though. In fact, if anything, she seems overwhelmed by her emotions. but Meg Travers never communicates that effectively, and it's a shame because it lets the whole thing down. Unfortunately, I never thought that Suzy jumped off the page. She felt flat to me, so I struggled to connect to her, and that meant that I didn't feel any of the emotions the story was trying to make me feel. In other reviews, I've seen people say that they thought it didn't make any sense that Suzy cares as much as she does that Emily's gone missing if she dislikes her so much, and that's something that I disagree with. In my opinion, Suzy's backstory provides a solid motivation for her actions. Unfortunately, I did feel that that motivation was a bit obvious. In fact, it becomes so obvious, so early, that I expected it to be a red herring and kept waiting for the twist to come, but it never did and things just were what they seemed. To tell you the truth, I hate picking it apart this much. It makes me feel guilty. This was Georgina Lees' debut novel, and I genuinely think she came out swinging. It's just that in my opinion, she missed more blows than she landed. I would hate for her to stumble across this review and think that I hated The Girl Upstairs, because I didn't. I just didn't feel that it quite lived up to its own potential. That's a massive shame though, because I can see how with a few changes, if the writing had been a bit clearer, the different points of view more distinct, if the pacing had been more consistent and the conclusion had been given more time to breathe, most importantly of all, if a different audiobook narrator had been cast, this could have been so much better. My question for today is this: what's the weirdest or funniest thing one of your neighbours has ever done? If you've enjoyed this video, the like and subscribe buttons are just sitting there, waiting to be pressed. Now press them, or I'll pay a team of university students who really need money to camp outside your house with paintball guns and instructions to open fire every time you try to leave. If you want to get in touch, say hi and have a chat, you know where the comment section is, and the link to my Twitter can be found in the description. Thanks ever so much for spending time with me today, guys. Until next time, take care. For now I'm off, and you should have a good one.